of such a civilizing mission would have been all too obvious to artists and intellectuals in colonial India, as we see from the trenchant critique of the Italian war in Africa in contemporaneous Indian newspapers such as the Bombay Chronicle. Thus, in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, Italy's aggression on Abyssinia, and the acceleration in military conflicts between Japan and Russia in outer Manchukuo, Tagore intercepted and visually transcribed the shifting allegiances of the interwar era. A newspaper photograph of a military parade in Moscow's Red Square that stood in for Ravan's army, while the rehaul of Japan's military equipment under Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono functioned as a visual corollary for Ram's preparation for war. When collocated within the epic's narrative, such references render ambiguous the epic's demarcation of just action and unjust subjugation, mutating distinctions between the righteous hero Ram, here Japan's Fumimaro Kono, and Ravan, here Stalin. The Ramayana, the epic story of war, may well have lent itself to such creative subterfuges. As Moldakranta Bose has noted, the ambivalence, if not outright subversion, characterized the response to the Ramayana in Bengal since the 19th century. Recollect that Michael Madhusudhan Dotto's 1861 Meghnad Badkalpo had already rendered ambivalent, neat ethical binaries of just action and unjust action. Closer in time to Abanindranath, Sukumar Roy's Jatra, Adbhut Ramayana, which was performed in Shantiniketan in 1911, had relocated the epic to the court of a Bengali Jomidar, with Ram acting as the lord of the manor and his monkey army as reluctant followers enticed into action with money and favors. Ray's relocation of the Ramayana to the courts of the landed aristocracy not only served to ground the epic within the socio-cultural milieu of 20th century Bengal, but also enabled a number of comic maneuvers that ultimately undermined the ethical code of righteousness that was understood to underpin the actions of the exemplary king and his heroic entourage. Abanindranath's manuscript can perhaps be situated within this history of vernacular critical traditionalism. But the art historical sources for Abanindranath's technique of collage, however, are significantly more difficult to pin down. Indeed, no Indian artist had experimented with collage at the time. In Europe, however, the history of collage as a medium remains deeply entangled with the history of early 20th century modernism. This history, predictably, begins with the Cubist experiments by Picasso and Braque, but the technique of collage and photomontage had gained momentum in Europe precisely during the interwar years, whereby mass-circulated propagandist images were recomposed by avant-garde German modernist artists such as Raoul Haussmann and Hannah Hawks to undermine the perpetuation of violence in the name of nationalism. Whether Tagore had seen Picasso and Braque's paper collages is difficult to ascertain. But his own collages were certainly similar to his German Dada contemporaries. Abanindranath may well have been introduced to Dada works by the Jewish Moravian art historian Stella Cranbridge, who had come to Kolkata at Rabindranath's invitation. However, the extent of Abanindranath's familiarity with Dada collages is difficult to ascertain. Indeed, he may have been far more familiar with Dada figures like Hans Arp, Michael Duchamp, and Max Ernst, who were far better known, even at the time, than Raoul Haussmann and Hannah Hawk, whose politically confrontational anti-fascist, anti-Nazi tactics necessarily meant that their works were not included in European mainstream art publications to which Abanindranath might have had access. What conditions, we might then ask, made possible such a radical intermeshed account of the Ramayana and the interwar world by Abanindranath, an Indian artist, a colonial subject who had never travelled outside of East India? Why collage? Why in the 1930s? Several compelling questions come to the fore. The broader political culture of anti-fascism provides some answers. Recollect that between 1934 and 37, several anti-imperial, anti-fascist cultural organizations had been formed in India. For instance, in 1934, probably in the evening of Saturday, 24th November, the literary stalwarts Mulkraj Anand and Syed Sajjad Zahir had laid the groundwork for the Indian Progressive Writers Association from the Nanking restaurant in London's Denmark Street. When the first major conference of the Indian Progressive Writers Association took place in Lucknow in 1936, the inspiration for the gathering came from the first Congress of the International Association of Writers for the Defense of Culture against Fascism that had taken place in Paris only in the previous year, and which included figures like Gorky, E.M. Foster, Brecht, André Malraux, and Mulkraj Anand, among others. Subsequently, the Progressive Writers Association of India would send a message to the Second Congress of the Anti-Fascist International Writers Association in London in 1936, condemning Mussolini's subjugation of Abyssinia in no uncertain terms. Today, the spectre of a world war haunts the world, he wrote. Fascist dictatorship has revealed its militarist essence by its offer of gun instead of butter and the lust of empire building in place of cultural opportunities, the declaration stated. The methods resorted to by Italy for the subjugation of Abyssinia have rudely shocked all those who cherish a faith in reason and civilization. Signatories to the document included prominent authors, artists, and journalists, including Rabindranath, the journalist and publisher Ramananda Chatterjee, and the artist Nandulal Bose. Then, when the Indian Committee of the League Against Fascism and War was set up in Kolkata shortly after the bombing of Guernica, it was Rabindranath who became its first president. Only in the previous year, Rabindranath had sketched a rather startling image of Mussolini and penned a poem in response to Italy's invasion of Abyssinia. This was Abanindranath's immediate 1930s interwar cultural context, a cultural context that was no doubt far different from the Swadeshi nationalism of the early years of the 20th century. In the mid-1930s, anti-fascism obsessed Indian intellectuals, in part because of the rising tide of pro-fascist, pro-Nazi sentiment within the country. Indeed, a number of organizations across India were already active in spreading fascist propaganda, as Benjamin Zakaria, Chris Manjapa, Manu Goswami, and several others have recently pointed out. This caused a growing fissure within the Indian intellectual and political spheres. Indian artists and intellectuals such as Abanindranath had forged ties with Japanese aesthetes and ideologues in the first decade of the 20th century, ties that had already become estranged during the interwar years due to a widening ideological gap. Now, with the rising tide of fascism within the country, nationalism too took on ambivalent shadings. For many Indian observers could easily track affinities between the contemporary semantics of anti-colonial nationalism and the nationalist semantics of fascism. Fascism is a particular manifestation of nationalism, the historian Shoshobun Shorkar would observe in 1933. The followers of Mussolini and Hitler declaimed the same catchwords: national unity, national interest, and national endeavor. Nationalism soon turns into imperialism. Every fascist dreams of national glory, Shorkar wrote. Shorkar was of course not exceptional in his anti-fascist stance. Neither were Abanindranath's anti-fascist collages an aberration. Both ciphered an emergent universalist sentiment that condemned imperialist war in any form, in any part of the world. More than ever, global anti-imperial intellectual circuits were beginning to get tightly knit. Think again of Mulk Raj Anand. 1936 saw Anand at the International Writers in Defense of Culture Conference in London and at the Brussels World Peace Conference, and then in Spain with the International Brigade on the Republican side in the trenches of the Spanish Civil War. Writing to the Indian Congress Socialist from Madrid, he drew striking parallels between the fate of Spanish farmers under Franco and agrarian workers in India under the double oppression of Indian landlords and the British imperial government. On his way back to London in 1937, he stopped in Paris, this time to visit Pablo Picasso's studio to see the nearly completed Guernica with the leftist poet and former surrealist Tristan Tzara. The next year saw him in Kolkata, where he visited Rabindranath and Abanindranath. In part, these new alliances set the stage for Abanindranath's own foray into what I'm calling an anti-fascist collage practice. In part, the presence of a cosmopolitan cast of characters in Tagore's collages was premised on the technological advances of the era. We do know that from the late 19th century onwards, with a worldwide network of British-owned undersea cables in place, the British news agency Reuters gained monopoly as instant providers of news throughout the world, from Calcutta to Cairo. By the early 20th century, both English and vernacular newspapers throughout the British Empire subscribed to Reuters as their source of foreign news, even as they routinely critiqued its empire-centricism in their editorials. If on the one hand, this connected Europe and the colonies, on the other hand, it connected a vast anti-imperial network that stretched across the Afro-Asian worlds. The dreams and goals of the colonized were thus never fully constrained by the borders of colonial states. The world was distant, yet still very close. Let us take Abyssinia, for example. The Italian operations in Abyssinia had received extensive coverage from Indian-owned anti-empire newspapers such as the Leader, Tribune, and the National Herald. Given the increasing significance of aerial warfare, a number of newspaper reports, such as the ones on the screen, also carried photographs of the menacing bombers used by Mussolini in the Italo-Abyssinian War that had resulted in the subjugation of Ethiopia and its annexation into the newly created colony of Italian East Africa. The Modern Review, from which Abanindranath excerpted many photographs, had gone one step further. Along with photographs of bomber airplanes, the journal also featured lavishly illustrated essays on the social and cultural lives of Abyssinians prior to the military conflict with Italy. Through such interjections, artists such as Abanindranath may have developed a transnational visual imaginary that stimulated collective identification across colonized worlds based on the intensity of lived experiences under subjugation. In the colonial cultural imaginary, the fascist claim to Abyssinia, an event that indelibly altered the political fabric of Europe, had a very specific resilience. It became conjoined in the Indian intellectual imaginary with European imperialism's encroachment on the sovereignty of people of color. As intellectual and political forces gathered momentum across the world in the anti-fascist struggle for freedom and human rights, nothing seemed more certain to colonial intellectuals than that the towers of London, Vienna and Paris were about to fall. As Abanindranath's somewhat younger contemporary, Ulgrajanan, had declared in 1937. The perceived fragility of the old imperial orders of Europe may have fostered a utopian politics of non-hierarchical equivalence. The imaginative forces that utopia unleashed in the realm of culture opened up a range of formal and aesthetic considerations centered, albeit differentially, on the relative efficacy of the eye. As an artist, the act of seeing and transferring vision into form through lines, colors and shapes had long concerned Abanindranath. But to the artist, perception had initially appeared to be analogous to spiritual meditation, a process of turning away from the perceptible outer form towards an inner spiritual essence. In a 1915 text, he had thus posited transcendental or metaphysical vision as the primary vision of the artist. In other words, he understood perception to be the process of exceeding the outer form to access the formless core of things. But the artist had subsequently begun to understand perceptible form, not the formless, to be the primary domain of the artist. Thus in 1929 he writes, "However tiny the form may be, it is nothing but form, not a portal to the spirit, not the formless." For a moment, it appears as if Abanindranath wishes to take the representation of perceived reality as the primary ground for artistic practice. The moment, however, is fleeting. Almost immediately, he declares perception to be fundamentally unstable, culturally coded, and hindered by systems of knowledge that rise from the subconscious to moderate the optical immediacy of seeing. Originating from such a fallacy, representation can only be lacunary in character, the representation of an unstable perception, illegibly distanced from reality, and therefore necessarily unable to make reality present. In his collages, Abanindranath manipulates this lacunary nature of representation. Cutting and pasting paper of varying opacity, he creates three stratums that are attached to one another only loosely. The first layer, a thin sheet of ruled paper, contains handwritten text. In the text, the duplicitous demon, Shurpanakha, prepares to transform into an exquisite woman, more beautiful than the Florentine marble Venus de Medici. The aim is to entice the virtuous King Ram. But we do not know yet whether the subterfuge is successful. Threaded to the first only through dramatic suspense, the second stratum is excerpted from an English newspaper. The page contains reviews of contemporary film and theatre, forms that seek to stage an experience of the real. The precise date and name of the newspaper remains unclear. A wristwatch is pasted in the place where the name of the newspaper and the date may have been printed. The third stratum, the last sheet of paper, duplicates an aspect of the previous stratum. It contains images of a number of wristwatches, as if giving visual parallel to the passage of time. This composite image of time is necessarily paradoxical. Each watch indicates different hours of the day. Yet, as representations detached from the continuum of their everyday existence as timekeepers, the images can only be empty signs. However realistically presented to the eye, the images cannot, by the very definition of representation, mark the passage of time. The representation of the watch, the artist seems to suggest, is as unstable as the demon preparing to transform into a human momentarily, however optically convincing such a transition may be. Given his aversion to realism, Abanindranath's placement of news photographs at the very heart of his project is puzzling. The artist believes that as a mechanically reproduced image governed by laws of science, photography can register presence in a way that the human eye cannot. But given his aversion to the ocular perception of reality as the sole basis of aesthetic practice, his disdain for photography is also to be expected. By its very constitution, the camera can register the reflection of a visible form, the artist indicates. The camera can register the appearance of the world as it is, and thus function as a medium for realism. But the artist insists on another order of experience. What the camera cannot do, Abanindranath writes, is to record what does not exist in any kind of tangible material form. Therefore, he mutilates photographs. Wrenching them away from the real, he inverts their documentary function. Then, misappropriating photography's reality effect, he re-insinuates the picture of reality with meanings never intended in the original